You ready, Mike? Yeah. No. Morning, everybody. Thank you. I'm not going to be saying much. I'm just here to introduce Chris so he doesn't have to introduce himself. There's not much housekeeping. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, when you get to the coffee break and lunch is all on the 4th floor. Drinks at the end of the day are also on the 4th floor. If you want to go and have a look at the Zulu exhibition, which is just having its finishing touches being done to it, so it's a bit of a preview. It doesn't officially open until Saturday. You can go up on the 2nd floor during any of the breaks and have a look, and I'm sure Alex will show you around. Have a think for any questions or any topics you want to discuss this afternoon for the experts panel. The editors will be a different set of people to the panellists yesterday. So any questions about being an editor or writing articles and what editors are looking for, or any of the themes that we talked about yesterday. And introducing Chris. Oh, is there any dinner money outstanding? A couple of people still owe Chris money for dinner. And there are a couple of people who weren't here yesterday who need to give their dinner order to me. So I've got the menus if you come and see me, and I'll give you the menu so you can pick your choices. So Chris doesn't really need much of an introduction. Past president, responsible largely for the move to this building. So if it wasn't for Chris, we'd be sitting in 41 still at the moment. With no air conditioning, and then no heating in the winter and no lift either. Chris is here really as his role as chairman of the collections, which is the last full day today, isn't it, Chris? So from tomorrow, me and the collections are somebody else's problem. So over to you, Chris, and he's going to talk about translating articles.
Cheers. It's there we are. We talked a little bit yesterday, sort of tangentially, about translation, machine translation, and artificial intelligence. This is an article from the This is an article from this morning's BBC, and it's been translated into Russian. I'm going to translate it suddenly into Portuguese. So, Eduardo, Luis, how bad is that? In fact, I suspect it's better than readable. It's pretty good. There are some, what in English you might call infelicities, better ways of saying something. But it's not bad. Here we now have it in German. Jürgen. How bad is that? I'll come on to Google Translate. It says start free trial up there, but actually I've got a paid-for version of this. It's a German company called DeepL, and it's about €80 a year. Bitte. How bad is that? Mario, you're next.
I think that's pretty good. it's interesting to see in the third paragraph, you've got a briefing. In Denmark, they do pick up a lot of English words, and obviously, having been away for 50 years, I keep learning Danish language, which has got new English words in them, so that's quite amusing. But besides that, it's pretty perfect.
It was extraordinary, in fact. In the 50-odd years I've been going to and from Denmark, the word ja or yo, yes, has suddenly turned into yes. All young people say yes. It's really strange. Jona, Italian.
Yeah, Jona, that's right, Italian.
There we go.
Anyway, I have already read in English before.
And it's not bad English either. but how's the Italian?
Italian, la capitale attenzione si è concentrata sul movimento del gruppo Wagner sul sito. It's quite good, I think, and also I use deeply because Thomas Matin is using in the university, and he told me that is the best, let me say, in the translator. And anyway, I try to make my translation from Italian in English. I send some English native, and he said that is near perfect. Yeah. Near perfect.
It's
absolutely.
It is pretty. And Jonas.
Where's Jon?
I have experience recently myself now, and as I have not yet learned the German language, so I am translating everything from German to Swedish or English, and it works very well with DeepL. So I'm pleased with this.
Julio Maris here.
No, he went home yesterday.
Yeah, he's already gone home.
Steve. The short answer is no, but nearly. Anybody else speak another language here?
Yeah. Chinese, please.
Chinese, please.
Jack.
Chinese simplified. Well, stand up and come closer to the front. Or get a pair of glasses, Jack.
All right, no, I have to be honest, for normal news, should be all right, And I think the problem is, if you translate, the special, say, philatelic newspapers or something, is a problem.
Yeah.
Normal, yeah.
And that's what I'm going to tell you about.
All right, okay, thank you.
That's why I put up a BBC. BBC writes very clearly, and they tend not to use extra words or extra phrases. And it translates really pretty well using DeepL. Translates pretty well also using using Google Translate. I've just got to find my presentation. Oh, for heaven's sake. Good. Does this work? Perfect. Okay. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not a linguist. I know an awful lot of philatelic German. I know an awful lot of philatelic Danish. And with some help from my friends, I can pick through philatelic French. But I'm not I'm English, and somehow the English lack a gene for speaking languages other than English. It's probably because we've stolen most of the words from most other languages. And we've got 3 words for everything. Whereas in Danish, for example, they have the same word for many things. And it's complicated. But we have, Beata and I, translated a lot of particularly Danish and German articles going way back to fakes, forgeries experts when Knud Mohr was the editor. And I have done a lot of books, and they come in English, translated often by the author. and my job has been to turn the English into English. Because a lot of our colleagues in Philatelic are good English speakers, but they're not very good English writers. So this is an overview about some of the challenges, and I showed you how good the online translations are these days, and they really are quite good. And as Jack pointed out, they're not actually that good at doing some other things, particularly where technical subjects are concerned. So digital translation. And I say it's improved beyond recognition, especially in the last 10 years. It's unbelievable. Google Translate, you probably all know, and it's free. DeepL says it's the best there is, and they use artificial intelligence and all sorts of things. And it's not bad, but actually, when you're using these online translators, it's best to use both of them and then make a decision. And there are not just these two, these are just two the best known. And you can use these for a basic text and modify it to create a final text. That's the bit we did first. So, the world's most accurate and nuanced machine translation, says DeepL. Speak to an expert. There we are. So here's a real text. Except this text is legalistic, it's Danish, it's bureaucratic, and it's mid-19th century. So there we go, that's the easy bit, a postal reform, the Postal Act of 11th March 1851 by Carsten Jensen. And so he's written this little bit. This is a piece of introduction, and it translates really quite well. And this is an article which is appearing in Nordisk Philatelic Tidsskrift in September. It's the first quarter of the new year. They're going to do an article in English in each of the quarters coming through the coming year to celebrate their 25 years, I think, of the Copenhagen Philatelic Club, KPK. Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Quite quickly I realized it could very easily be old wine in new bottles. Now that works in English. You have to be very careful with idiomatic language. I once translated something by Mr. Ferkenbauer, Austrian, a wonderful, wonderful catalogue. He 4 volumes. But he wrote an article, and he's a bit of a joker, and he had a lot of jokes in, and a lot of plays on words, and it's almost impossible to translate these, and I'll come back to that later. Yeah, and so what you have there is, quite quickly I realized that it could very easily be old wine in new bottles, and I've changed that, so quite quickly I realized that this could very easily be. One of the things that happens in Danish and German is they tend to repeat the subject repeatedly, whereas in English we refer to the subject using this and it and so on. So it can be very clunky in English to do direct translation. Yes, as well as the general practice in postal processing, as well as by general practice in postal processing. You pays your money, you takes your choice. There we go. This is the period before the Postal Act came into force. Yeah. So it used the word, that word motivation. It translated as motivation, but it's the initiative behind. So actually, if you're going to try to translate using a machine, you need also to be aware of the nuances yourself and to be aware of the subject. And one of the huge problems, and Patrick Marsalis does this, and the translations that the Monaco Club did while Patrick was the president were phenomenally good, but he went to translation agencies by and large, and they tend not to have necessarily the technical expertise, either for the social history, the political history, or the postal history, or the philatelic history generally. Yeah. And on it goes. And this has all been done using DeepL. And it's not good enough, but it is nearly good enough. Yes, here we go. You see, if you look in the first paragraph at the top, DeepL translates about the two proposals made in blah, 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 as the two proposals were still based on distance, and you need to turn it into English. It can be said the two proposals made in 1846 and 1848. You can't just use a machine translation to send to your editor and say, look, I've translated this for you, because actually it will not be right. And it will not be English as an English person, a native English speaker, would use. And that was all the easy part. And so I think I've bumped into pretty much every obstacle that you can imagine in trying to deal with translations over the last 40 years. I said earlier that facility with spoken English isn't the same as facility with written English. And we're very lucky as English speakers, because English is very much the second language of the world in many parts of the world. So, yeah, many fewer write English well, and computer programs don't always translate that well. So Earth people, we come in peace, let's enjoy fun. We are not eating you quickly. And so you have to be immensely careful with Google Translate, or indeed with DeepL, and we'll come on to some more of those in a moment. Yeah. So this is a supplementary postal convention with Great Britain. Okay. It's still doing pretty well. The Danish share of the postage, a penny per copy. This is to do with postal prix courant being sent across the North Sea. That's the DeepL Translate. And this is the Google Translate. The Danish postage share of 1 penny per specimen, whereas DeepL says the Danish postal share of 1 penny per copy, which I prefer. And it is worthwhile comparing your translations. But my favorite here is, yes. So that's DeepL. The Middle Kingdom, I thought that was fantastic. You know, you have this vision of hobbits delivering the mail. And there's Google Translate into country, Melemriske. And Google is better than DeepL. But you need to be aware of that. This is absolutely prix courant, yeah? So, and again, it's DeepL. Not only do we have hobbits delivering them, but they're bringing their prize currents with them as well. So you do this, you deal with these machine translations at your peril. Yeah, I mean, even Google Translate has got them as price currents. I don't know whether that's an electricity bill or what, but you actually have to be very, very careful. And if you're using these kinds of programs, you really do need to find an English speaker to assist you and to apply reason and common sense to a translation. Another piece of DeepL, another piece of Google Translate. And, okay, Danish and German have capital letters where English doesn't have capital letters. And your automatic translation programs will deliver capital letters randomly for you. and you never know whether you're getting the right thing or the wrong thing. And again, you need somebody to apply reason and common sense to it. There you see copy with a capital C, per copy. Yeah. So, and then there's my version of it. So in a way, you actually have to, they do need to be rewritten. It's actually not bad to send an article to your friend saying, here's what I've got, and I've translated it using DeepL, Google Translate, or whatever for you, but it's not ready for publication, believe me. And then there are other technical and financial issues. And the problem is that Philatelic and many other, I suspect if you want to translate, for example, the technical specification of an icebreaker from German into Chinese, you'd be in a certain amount of difficulty. And it's just the same way in trying to translate using these machine translators from 19th century postal laws into 21st century English, from whatever language. Well, one of the other problems is that a lot of German postal history sources are written in Gothic script. And the same is true in Danish and in other languages. And scanning Gothic script into Latin script, you would think would be possible, but it is a technology which is still, after 25 years, in its infancy. What's it called? A-B-B-B-Y, what's the name of that company? Abbey. Abbey does a fracture scanning program. It doesn't work. It doesn't work too badly, but it doesn't work well enough because there are many different forms of fracture. So that's why these texts are not really part of artificial intelligence data. They're not part of the large data set. So if they're not part of the large data set, you're not going to get a decent translation. And I think we're years away from this because we are definitely a niche area, philately. And there's not a lot of, the demand is not there. You'll be getting icebreaker translations long before you're going to get postal law translations, I think. So, there's too much variety, there's too little digitized, and there's too little translated. So the data sets are poor for technical philately and postal history. There we go. Where did I get that from? Mr. Google, where else? And words count. Here's another. I'm not providing you with any solutions. What I'm trying to do is to show you some of the risks. Now, this is the title of my little talk today, an overview of the challenges in translating articles for philatelic journals. 77 characters, including spaces. Here it is in French. And astonishing, here we find the French and the English agreeing with each other that there are 77 characters. And in Spanish, 79. In Danish, 89. What's coming next? Yes! Spanish, Danish. And then in German comes to the end, 108. And it is generally true. And so, you're going to make a translation for the editor of a particular journal. And one of the first things you need to say to the editor is, I'm going to do this in English, it's going to be a third less. So how are you going to manage that translation? Are you going to run it paragraph against paragraph? Are you going to run it in 2 columns? How are you going to, we'll talk about illustrations later on. But languages have different character counts. And German is the biggest. No? Oh, God, I thought you were going to tell me another language that had more characters. Russian. Right. Okay, that's interesting. I haven't done Russian. But it is an issue for an editor and page counts and so on. I mean, we've often, I'm sure those of you who are editors of journals have been asked, well, why don't you translate the occasional article into English for a non-English journal, or into Spanish or German for a British journal? And it's actually quite a difficult thing to do, and it really does increase the page count, which I'll come on to. Yes, because words cost. So articles in translation increase the page count, and the printing and postage costs increase. And if you've got a project, and I spoke to the editor of Nordisk Journalistisk Tidsskrift, NFT, about this, who wanted to produce these quarterly, and they're long articles, 22 pages, the one that appears in September. And I said, has KPK sorted out the budget for the postage? Yes, they have, because Lars Peter Svensson is president still, is he? Yeah, and he's an accountant. So but you do have to, if you're going to do journals in translation, you actually have to think, well, what are you going to translate? Are you going to translate the club news? Are you simply going to translate the key article for that particular issue? And the other thing is, if you're going to include articles in translation, you're going to extend your deadlines, because not only do you need the thing translated, you need somebody to read it through, because you do not want to trust a single translator, in my opinion. So you more or less need a translator and something more than a proofreader, and something perhaps a little less than a peer reviewer. And it's a big issue. And I've already referred to this. Is your text going to be in 2 columns, paragraph by paragraph, end on? First of all, the article in its original language, and then secondly, the article in its translated language. And what do you do with illustrations? You don't want to use your illustrations twice. So in each case, you need to have the translation and the original. And that's going to increase your space count. Unfortunately, this is a subject I know quite a bit about, so translating this is really quite easy. This is the translation I can do myself. But, you know, this is 4 lines there, and I guess if we reduce the font size and we make it italic, we might just possibly squeeze it into 4 lines in English, but it doesn't look like it to me. So more issues. So how do you deal with illustrations in a bilingual text? Because the language lengths are going to be different. The illustration is going to appear at a different place. And again, I was sent a text with illustrations which were not numbered. And so you actually have to number them so you can refer to the item, the illustration in both texts by number, because then it doesn't matter where it is. As I say, illustrations must be numbered, otherwise any further reference to it might be lost. And you know, and again, it's a long article. This one I'm doing for September, 22 pages, and it was going to be impossible. I'm actually talking to the editor tomorrow on this particular issue. And we all know this, but we don't always do it. Illustrations need to be provided separately from any text, and according to whatever specifications your editor says. And of course, then you're dealing with the translator, the original, the illustration, the translation to the caption to the illustration, the proofreader, and the possible peer reviewer. So all of a sudden, instead of dealing with one writer, you're dealing with a cast of many people potentially. And it's why we don't very often do this. I mean, there are magazines, the Royal produces an annual publication in China, which is largely bilingual, but not entirely. And we're fortunate there that the editor is from Hong Kong, and his English is extremely good, and his Chinese, not Cantonese, but Mandarin is also extremely good. So there, you've got to work with a lot of capital letters. And here we are in German. Überblick, Herausforderungen, Übersetzung, nouns, Zeitschriften. But in English, no capital letters. It gets worse. It gets much, much, much worse. When did we put the Global Philatelic Library together the first time? And we're talking to the APRL. And the APRL catalogue appears to have no diacritics in it whatsoever. And we said to the person responsible at the time, why are there no diacritics? And the answer was, because we leave them out. And, you know, these are just the capital letters. You know, because you've got Polish L's, and you actually have to be true to the language. It's like when you get people's names wrong. You know, people's names are personal and people's languages are personal, and you really don't want to mess about with them. So diacritics is a huge issue in catalogues and in translations. I say no more than that because they're quite hard to handle sometimes. And there are some fonts which don't include all diacritics, and some italic fonts which have even fewer diacritics. So you need to make sure that your journal uses a font which includes all the diacritics. It's really not very straightforward. Yeah, so here we go. This is the title of an article, a journal, a book. And there we go, we've got a U-umlaut, an A-umlaut in Regierungspräsidium, and there, französische Streitkräfte, and in French. You so often see, this is the title of a book. It's like somebody's name. And you cannot, in my opinion, leave out the original spelling in the original language. You don't put that title, Catalogue des Oblitérations, without the E acute. So you owe it to the author, and we owe it to the book to get the titles right. And it's one of my favourite place names in Denmark, Ærøskøbing, which has got an AE, and a Købing, and or here. Yeah, you really got to be careful. And I mentioned earlier our good friend in Austria and his sense of humour. And it really, really, really is difficult. This is the editor's note. This drawing is by a new contributor of foreign extraction. She does her work in an extinct language and refuses to translate it, but she assures us that it's very funny. I mean, Beata and I have sat with a joke, because we think it's a joke, often in German, trying to come up with an English equivalent. And it really is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I think I can be quite funny, but I do find translating jokes very, very hard. Jokes. And it's not just jokes. Well-known phrases and sayings, puns, other plays on words are often untranslatable because especially when you rely on alliteration. You know, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper, all of which begins with P. We put that in any other language and you can guarantee there are very few P's in the translation. And poems and rhymes. And you've got to tell your authors, put your jokes in French, Italian, German, whatever, Russian. But, you know, we might leave them out. And we might put something suitable in another language. So well-known phrases and sayings. Right. This is a, yep. Even the blind hen can find a grain of corn. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah, and this is the nearest German I could make, which is, everything's got an end, only a sausage has two. I figured they're the same thing. There we go. All good things must come to an end. Ein Spatz in der Hand ist besser als ein Tauber auf dem Dach. Sparrow in the hand is better than a pigeon on the roof. No, that's not funny. It's perfectly normal German. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. But you know, these are really difficult to translate because you actually have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of well-known phrases and sayings and proverbs in your own language. Yeah, no, it's ugly. That's the ugly dictionary. Ah, this is a Danish one. En fugl I hånden bedre en 10 på taget. That is, a bird in the hand is better than 10 on the roof. Same thing. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Poems, yeah? I'm not going to read this to you because Beata will kill me. But it's, we worked quite hard on trying to translate this. And you can see you've got the endings dude, gore, blude, saw, alla, små, falla, går. The endings on the rhyme. And so, you know, we did this God's peace with our dead, see dead and bled, but we could not find anything to rhyme with either garden or grief that fitted the scansion or the intent of the author. And then I think B did this, our love with all the great and small who would stand and fall with the lion ashen grey. And it's not quite the same rhyming, but it works quite nicely, we thought. But that took a long time. So when you do get people who want to quote poetry and so on, it's often best to leave it in the original language and let the reader sort it out. This is a poem by Grundtvig. Grundtvig was a priest, 19th century, whose great-great-grandson is head of Philatelic at Brun Rasmussen in Copenhagen these days. And this is after the Battle of Isted, which is the reference to the lion ashen grey. The lion was the symbol of Isted, and Isted was a defeat for the Danes in the First Schleswig War. And you need to know a bit about that too if you're going to work the translation, because you need to understand the historical context of the piece of writing that was made. Other limitations. No machine translation will correctly translate historical names, trades, countries and other place names, technical terms, philatelic terms, and other terms which might seem just random. I'm sure it'll come. Well, actually, I'm not entirely sure when, but I'm sure it will come. And all machine translations need human intervention. If you want something translated really well into English and German, you go to Phil Robinson up in the north of England, and he'll do a bloody good German translation for it because he thinks in German. Place names. Well, the Brits here will be familiar with Munich, the Black Forest, and the Kiel Canal, and Hanover with one N. München, Schwarzwald, Nordsee Canal, and Hanover with two N's. You've got to make your mind up how you're going to deal with place names. Do you translate them? Or do you not? And then Leghorn. God knows how we ended up in English with Leghorn, because that's Livorno. Turin, Venice, Tuscany, etc. But yeah, Livorno, Torino, Venezia, Toscana. And that's pretty straightforward. But I did a book once which had European named places in the Ottoman Empire before 1878. You've seen that? Yeah, okay, so that is from a postal law in Danish for rates to European Turkey. And you can see you've got Adrianople, Bari, Burgas, Kavala, Constantinople, which enough. And this is from the official notices from from the Post Office Management from 1869. So I was given pages of postal laws with all of these place names. And Germany in particular has and German languages in particular, and Eastern European languages have a different relationship with European Turkey than the Romance and the Nordic parts of Europe. So some are fine, Candia and Lagos and others, but you know, Plovdiv in Bulgaria, Philatelic. I mean, if you're doing this for an audience which recognizes the place names, that's fine. But if you're not, you're going to have to get these researched. And for this particular book, I was sat at the table with a pre-1878 map of the Ottoman Empire, looking for place names in the Balkans and on the Greek and Mediterranean coast, because that's where most of the place names came, and on the Black Sea too. So translation is unbelievably difficult to do well, particularly in postal history, in my opinion. And just a few more. And the Ottoman Empire is really quite interesting because it covers Albania, it covers Turkey and Greece, and well, more or less, not quite up to the gates of Vienna, but it's a large slice of the Balkans. And these are simply the port names. And they change, place names. Even recently, Leningrad. And then abbreviations. Some languages use abbreviations extensively, not just etc. Und so weiter in German, but shorthand in specialist or technical handbooks. There are books of abbreviations. There are dictionaries of abbreviations. And there are multi-language dictionaries of abbreviations. And here, for example, on the left are abbreviations which Danish philatelists use for different kinds of post office. HPK, Hovedpostkontor, Postkontor, head post office, that's easy. But then, the country you're trying to translate from might have had different kinds of post offices from the language you're trying to translate into. And they are fundamentally untranslatable. So not only are they an abbreviation, but they might not exist in the language you want them to be in. I won't go through all those, but you get the picture. Then there are technical terms. This completely baffled me. This is Litsenbruder, Litsenbor in Danish. Okay, this is a dictionary definition. A guild-like organization that existed in Pomeranian cities, and you can read it as well as I do. But basically, they were a conspiracy against the passengers because they had the monopoly on carrying the bags. So you needed your bag taken from your coach to your hotel and vice versa, or from the coach to the boat, the Litsenbro in Danish, had to carry them because that was the local rule. And Litsenbruder are not the only ones. I came across a list of all of the people you would need to give a tip to if you were traveling from Hamburg to Copenhagen as you moved from inn to inn. And it was basically a local conspiracy to keep people in employment. And I think you might find your luggage in the sea if you didn't actually use the Litsenbruder. Yeah. And then technical terms, bootdruk. We have enough trouble with book printing and what it actually means in English. Boekdruk, typography or letterpress, probably. Kopperdruk, kupferdruk, engraving, gravure. Yeah, Pragedruk, that's embossing. Planetol, ha, trade name. PVA gum. Pergament papier. That's a kind of vegetable parchment. They used to use it for sealing labels when the post office officially opened and sealed letters. They used these pergament papier to do it. It's a glassine type of paper. I hope I'm putting you off, because it really is not easy. Now, there are some extraordinarily good online dictionaries, and some of those online dictionaries will also produce a word used in context, and they'll offer you 10 or 12 different contextual uses that you can make a judgment from. One of my favorite German dictionaries is this reference here. dict.cc, and it's very, very, very helpful, and includes some earlier uses. Okay, now go back to other problems. There's no budget for translation in a journal, by and large, so you're relying on a volunteer. And if you listen to what I've been saying, you might be relying on 2 or 3 volunteers. Most philatelic translation is unpaid. And there are excellent translators available, but most are volunteers, and beware of getting what you didn't pay for. You do see really quite bad translations, which is why I've said you need to find more volunteers. But you need to do that with a book in English as well, you know. I mean, I'm trying to help see a book to publication in the autumn, and apart from the authors, the most important person is the peer reviewer. And you need to find peer reviewers who really know their subject. So, some suggestions. I did a translation. I agreed to proofread a translation in English on a subject which I won't mention. And it arrived, and it was not easy. And I said, can I see the original? And there was no original. I said, well, why is there no original? Answer, my daughter did it. And she's a medic in London, so she speaks good English. But she didn't speak good philately or good history. And if you are involved in getting a translation done, don't just accept the text in whatever language your preferred language is. You need to have the original language, otherwise you can't find out what on earth was originally meant. Oh, yeah. And then, you know, this happened to me only a month ago. I get a text, and I go through it, and we do the first rough draft, and then I get a revised text. But I don't know which parts have been revised. Well, I could run it. I could compare the 2 typescripts, except one was in a PDF and one was in a Word document. So, you know, you're just, you've really got to pin your author down and say, this is what I expect. Under these circumstances, we will do it. And if there are changed circumstances, do you know, we might not. Yeah. You get sent text in. Okay, I can take the text out of an Adobe document, but it doesn't necessarily bring the diacritics with it. So then you have to go back through it and insert all the umlauts, for example. Yeah. It was very helpful if your author, and you know, most authors are extremely good. They want to see their stuff published, and they do provide an English translation. But it isn't necessarily English as we know it. And then you've got to deal with your author and say, well, who's responsible for ultimately signing off on this text? Now, there's no right answer to that, but you do need an agreement, because you don't want your author kicking up after you've published the translation. So you need to tell the author that you as editor are responsible for the text, but she or he as author will get to see the final version. Don't just print and be damned. So do you need the author's consent for the translation? I would say it would be good practice to do that. And who owns the copyright? We're not going to discuss that, because we truly don't have time, and I'll only end up being confused. And invariably, your author will know a lot more than whoever's doing the translation. And authors must be prepared to help the translator, because you need to go back and say, this is what I think you mean. Is that what you really mean? Oh, yes. Two nations divided by a common language, amongst other things. Standardize or standardize. Flavor or flavour. Travelled or travel. Pediatric or pediatric. Defence or defence. Analog or analog. Crown or coronate. Coronate. Yeah. Well, I only put it in there, Dan, to prove the point and to give you an opportunity to wake everybody up. Because this time in the proceedings, people are beginning to glaze over. So thank you very much for that. Coronate. That's what we did to Prince Charles. And according to an American newspaper I read, he was coronated. It was an expensive procedure, believe me. So, oh yeah, I'd like to have a bath, or I'd like to take a bath. And you've got to decide what you're doing. I mean, I'm about to embark in the autumn on a series of articles for an American magazine. And I'm going to write it unmercifully in English. Because I'll get defense wrong. Yeah. And okay, you know, we all love Mr. Google and DeepL and Google Translate and everything else, but there are real books too. This is one of my favorite books. English-German dictionary from 1897, I think. I better just check that. Yes, 1897. The Flügel-Schmidt-Tanger English-German dictionary. And it's absolutely bloody wonderful, because it's likely to include some of these 19th century terms that you won't find in a modern dictionary. And there are wonderful dictionaries out there, technical dictionaries. I'm looking for a dictionary of typography, either English, German, or Danish English. There must be one out there somewhere. Yes. Good. Email. And so when I find these things, and there's quite a lot of them on the internet, download them before they move them. You know, there are business terms, but if you get a business dictionary or directory from the 1880s or 1890s. I was going to say they're extraordinarily useful. They're useful to some of us. So, yeah. And then there are other books. This is a brilliant little book by the Germany Philatelic Society in the United States, and it is simply a German-English philatelic dictionary. And it's got a wonderful section on abbreviations, and also a section on German military abbreviations. Super book. And this is another one. This is produced by Zumstein. Doesn't include English, but it includes Russian and German and French and other languages. Yeah, this is from a catalogue. It's a Danish-English word list produced by Facet, I think. No, AFA. And yeah, it's very basic, but you take the help from where you can get it. So downloadable books I've spoken about. This one is a legal dictionary from 1822. And also it's proven useful to me. The Danish Legal Dictionary. A dictionary of the Dano-Norwegian and English languages. This one fabulously included Litzenbruder, and very simply, a porter in a post office. Unfortunately, it's not quite right, because they were porters wherever. But it's not quite right, but it's nice to find the word that you won't find in most other modern German dictionaries. And then there's the library. These are dictionaries that we have here. We've mostly got the diacritics in. And on they go. So our library here has much more than you might imagine. And it's always worth asking Nicola, because Nicola is a librarian. She's not normally in charge of events or museums or accreditation or whatever, and she would love to be a librarian again. So you just ask her some nice library questions and you make her day. And we do have a lot. We have a lot. No. And yeah. Here they are, the cretins have come to visit us. You know. So I think that's me. It's an hour. And there you go. Some problems in translation. Go now.
Mark?
Yeah. All right.
This is not rosé wine, it's my morning energy drink. 300 calories.
I've very much enjoyed your presentation. Could you say just a few words about how you get the material into your computer to do the translation work? Are you using OCR programs, or are you typing it out longhand?
Well, most of what I've done is for other people, and they send me typescripts. And when they send me a Adobe Acrobat, I send it back and say I want it in Word. Because, I mean, that's one of the other things. What do you pay for when you pay for DeepL? You pay you put 5,000 characters in, it'll translate it. You put more than that in, it'll translate it. But the unpaid for versions will stop after 250 characters in some cases. So you actually have to keep cutting up your text to translate it. And cutting up a text is really very difficult because, sure as God made little apples, your technical translating program will stop in the middle of a sentence and not at a full stop. And of course, if you stop in the middle of a sentence, you don't necessarily have the whole meaning because what comes at the end of the sentence might modify what came at the beginning. So mainly I cut and paste. If it's for me and I've got an article I want to translate, I scan it, I OCR it, I tidy it up, and then I put it into the translator. But broadly, I like it in Word. I like it in Word rather than any other form because Word actually covers pretty much every character, every ASCII character that you can imagine. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Hi. Just a practical question. How do you find diacritics when your software doesn't have a symbols tab at the top right-hand corner?
I don't know. I don't know. That's why I like to get the text with the diacritic originally. You can search and replace, you know, or you can search, because if you copy, again in Word, an A umlaut into your search, it will find A umlauts. So you go somewhere else on the internet and you find, what are they called, these ligature characters? OE, for example. Ligatures, yeah. If you get a linked OE, you can find one on the internet, put it in your search in Word, and it will find every instance of that character, is how you do it. But you actually have to take a step outside, because if you don't know what if you don't know what you don't have, it's quite hard to find.
Can I just follow up on the previous question? If you scan a document, forget the 5,000, just a page or something, it will come out as a picture, as a JPG,
Yep.
JPEG. So I agree, Word is the system to use, but how do you then get it into your GU DeepL?
You use an optical character reading program. Sorry?
OCR.
Well, yeah, but optical character
Recognition.
OCR.
Yes.
Oh, yes, optical character recognition, apologies.
Yes.
Use an OCR program. So Abby does that. A full version of Adobe Acrobat will do that. And there are quite a lot of other programs, some of which are free. But I'm deeply suspicious of free programs. So basically, you take the steps it does. You make your picture, you turn your picture into text using an OCR program. You then compare that OCR text with the original text, because OCR is not necessarily 100% because it depends on the density of the ink. And if you've got a faint letter, it may not pick it up, so you need to check it. And then when you've got your text, you put it in the translator. It's a job, it's a labor of love and a job requiring much patience.
Maybe just adding to these questions, from about 20 years of using OCR, depending on the type the author has used, you can be astonished how bad the extraction is even from a PDF. You are pretty unlucky, for example, if somebody has chosen Times New Roman, that's awkward, because then typically characters R and N
touch each other,
go into an M.
Yes.
And so you have about 18%, 20% wrong characters in the words. So you first need to proofread the extracted text.
Exactly.
And so I perfectly follow that you say, give me the original text to avoid that tedious step.
And the other thing is italics.
Yep.
Italics quite often OCR very badly.
And
halves, you know, 1/2,
the fractions.
The fractions, yeah. Fractions, they don't OCR very well. And I've told you before, a Gothic script doesn't OCR very well, so we live in an imperfect world. It's why there's life before before artificial intelligence.
And
Yeah.
maybe one bit to the question before, if you don't know how to find the diacritics, you need to go out of the Word or whatever, but then check for the Unicode tables. And if you have an idea, if it's an A umlaut or an E with an accent, you can search those tables because each character has a name assigned. So if you have a faint idea of what it could be a name, then you could filter, say, all the variants of an A, and then by optical seeing the 25 choices you got,
Yep.
you possibly find the right one. And once selected, you see the name, and then later can refer to that one. It takes time, maybe it's 5 minutes per character until you go on to the next character. But if you really want to do it right in a foreign language, there are tools. It's not convenient, but you can help yourself going to the Unicode tables and names.
Yes, the ASCII codes, the Unicodes, and the word search, searching for symbols is actually pretty good too. So there are lots of ways of doing this, but all of them take quite a long time.
Yeah, it was a quick shortcut that I've discovered, but I'm an Apple Mac user. I'm assuming this works on PC as well because I'm using Microsoft Word. Is that if you're wanting the diacritics, if you are aware there's one there, just hold your finger on the key for more than 2 seconds, and a whole choice of diacritics comes up.
Not in IBM computers.
Well, that's the problem with IBM computers. Yeah, a good advert to buy.
And actually, to be perfectly honest, Gwyn, it doesn't produce all the characters even on the Mac keyboard.
Yeah. Well, as I say,
there's lots of them, but not all of them.
It's a Microsoft Word function,
Yeah.
I think, rather than the Mac. So if you hold the button down for the majority where it's available, it does show them, and you can choose them accordingly.
I find all potential sets of characters are incomplete when you come to look for them.
Chris?
Yes.
Talked about different fonts handling diacritics differently. Do you have a recommendation on what standard font to try and work in?
No, not really. They've all got limitations. Arial's pretty good. I use Gill Sans. That's not bad. But I don't know, and it's a really interesting question, which I've actually never asked myself, is which character set has which font has the most characters in it? And it's a question I don't know the answer to.
Do you prefer to work in sans serif rather than serif font?
I prefer to work in an unserifed font, yeah. Because the letters are more discrete. There's a separation between them. Whereas with the serif fonts, where the little bobbles on the end take your eye forward, which is good when you're reading, it's not good when you're searching or OCRing. So no, I don't have a preferred font. I mean, I use Times New Roman, I use Garamond, I use Gill Sans, I use Arial, and one or two others. But all of them have their limitations, particularly when making fractions. So no, I don't have an answer to your question, only just more problems. So.
I have a proposal for this one. I'm not saying it's a pretty font, but if you want to have all the characters in place and don't pay for it, then there is one which avoids the so-called tofu. In some fonts, if you enter a character which is not in the font, you see a large black rectangle, and typographs name this a tofu. And there's the no tofu font, Noto. It's huge and it's free. I think it's from Google. So look for Noto, N-O-T-O. And then you have a font where all the characters are present. Later decide if your favorite font has them which you actually
So you
use. But
change the font, and if it doesn't work,
possibly.
go back. Yes, quite.
But I once went writing up an exhibit, and only after 30 pages I found that my font I did select had not a pound sign. And
yeah,
so
no, it's an imperfect world, isn't it? An imperfect world.
Chris?
Yes.
I had a card which is in Japanese, and it's sent from America back to Japan. But I got a lady to try and translate it for me, and she couldn't, because it was done about 1912, and that Japanese is not taught in Japan anymore. So would the translators work to that, do you know?
I've no idea. Last time I had any Japanese to translate, I took it to my Japanese neighbour, and they were able to do that. And I recommend Nomura Asset Management, which is 2 streets towards the river, and see if anybody can help you. No, I don't have an answer. I'm sorry.
No, I know it's not easy, because she took it back to Japan for me, and she still couldn't find anyone to translate it.
No, Russian's difficult too, particularly, and of course, the difficulty is if you're trying to deal with manuscript texts. You know, I mean, manuscript Gothic German is legendarily difficult, but other manuscript texts are difficult, and they don't OCR, and you actually have to transcribe them, and you've got to find someone who can help. Our Polish cleaner used to help a bit, and we had a Japanese tenant. They were quite useful occasionally. And you know, most streets in my part of London have got loads of foreigners in it, so you can do quite well. You know, so it's a tricky one. No, I can't answer your question.
We use Arial for both the Norwegian Philatelic magazine and the Norwegian catalogue. And parts of the catalogue is bilingual, English and Norwegian. And of course, different number of characters in the different languages. So there is a lot of blank spaces, because the text is longer in English than in Norwegian. And we also have a dictionary, a philatelic dictionary. It means that every abbreviation we've used, every word that's sort of philatelic, can be translated into English, German, French. I don't think there's any other languages, but and the catalogue is available down in the library here.
Which catalogue is that?
The Norwegian Norgeskatalogen, as it's called.
Norgeskatalogen, okay.
So that's a fairly good catalogue when it comes to that, and it's well, have a look at it.
Yeah, no,
covers everything.
I will. Thank you. Thanks, Shell. That's helpful.
Chris, it's with regard to PDFs and extracting into Word. One of the options is to change the extension to zip, because Word docx's, at least, are zip files. So you can extract all the images, as an example, and with a bit of luck, you probably would be able to find the Word text as well. And I guess you wouldn't have the problem with umlauts and all that type of thing.
That's really interesting. I feel that the need for another lecture coming on, delivered by David. David Alford, on text programs. Because they are actually, all of the programs we use are infinitely more complicated than the uses we make of them. And, you know, we know what we know, but by God, we don't know what we don't know. And the unknown unknowns in PDFs and in Word and others are really, it's a very interesting area to explore. And I'm not very good at it. So thank you for telling me something I didn't know. I just now need to understand it. Thanks, David.
Possibly that was the last question.
No, that's the last question, because it's time for a break, isn't it? Or is it time for the next speaker?
It's time for the next speaker. So thank you very much, Chris.
I can go. Good.
And our next speaker is Mike. So we're a little bit early, so we'll have Mike do his bit, and then we'll have an early break for lunch.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think you must be able to hear that because I can hear the echoes. It might be surprising for you to know the first time I saw this was yesterday. So I haven't checked it through. And before anybody comes to me with all the mistakes and typos and stuff, I said, would you like to know? The answer's, no, I wouldn't. Now, I did ask whether a slideshow was required, and I was told it wasn't. You just stand up and talk about why you did it, how you did it. So, the why really starts with the family connection and my initial interest in postal history, which probably most of you know was the Falkland Islands. Why the Falkland Islands? Well, the family connection was my grandfather's brother, Captain David Roberts, who became manager of the Falkland Island Company in the 1930s. Before that, he was a master mariner. He got his master's ticket with the Pacific Steam Navigation Company. The other connection is that in studying Falkland Island postal history, between 1900 and 1917, the PSNC had the postal contract to deliver mail to the Falkland Islands. So, a number of members of the family have maritime connections. His son, Commander York Roberts, had absolutely nothing to do with the PSNC at all, but he was notably the Royal Navy's chief officer for the Cod Wars. You remember in Iceland in 1970. That, however, is irrelevant. It's just a bit of name dropping, really. Now, I hope that the way I've gone about this adheres broadly to the general principles that we learned from David Beach yesterday. So, in the hope that that's the case, I start off with some acknowledgements. And the people who I spoke to before I decided to embark on this collecting interest followed by a book. The principal two people were Brian Morehouse, who some of you will know very well, those who were connected with any sort of collecting in South and Central America, and a gentleman called Percy Bargoltz, who's a Swede, who I unfortunately never met, but we had an unending exchange of emails around 10 years ago. So that was the... once I decided that I was going to embark on this, I spent a lot of time with Brian, who taught me an awful lot. We went through the principal books, articles that existed in the same way that you described yesterday. The principal one of which was done by Doublet for the Royal in 1973. He produced a 70-page monograph about the PSNC. So one of the things I wanted to do was update that, go through all the records I could to find out, as far as it's possible to do, a list of all the marks that had been on the market in the last 50 years. That listing is obviously in the book, and I've equally no doubt that somebody somewhere will say, you haven't got mine in there, because that's what always happens. And when I was inspired to do the book, it was largely because of Frank Walton, who challenged me to basically get on with it. And also to learn how to typeset it in design, which was another challenge. And I said to him, well, would you think it was best to do a list now, publish it in the LP and see what you got back? Or is it best to put it in a book and say this is the best you can do now? And he said the latter. He said if you do the former, somebody will nick it from you and claim credit for having done it. So we've done it this way because that's what Frank suggested. So what did I start? I started with the same way that you would start an exhibit. You start with a plan. I wanted to go quite a bit further than Doublet did. I wanted to put in some universally what I thought was interesting commercial information about the company, not just its postal history. And I wanted to include a lot of publicity documents, partially because, selfishly, I've now taken to doing open exhibit philately. And I wanted to have a clear idea of the non-philatelic items that you could include in an exhibit like that, and have some idea of which was rare, which wasn't, and what there was there out in the marketplace. So that is why it's planned out the way it is. So I have included such items as the commercial history of the company, which was not covered by any of it's been covered in general terms elsewhere. The early postal history and markings of the PSNC, which was basically what Doublet did, but I've tried to update it. And then thirdly, we get to what is a controversial area, and that is the postage stamps of the PSNC. Now, those of you who know anything about the subject will know that despite the fact that William Wheelwright, who was the founder of the company, is an American, he raised the money in London eventually. It was his ambition to basically control the postal, well, the post office and post office rights, the rights to get the revenue for mail delivery on the west coast of South America. And what got in his way? Well, basically the Peruvian government, the Chilean government, and the Bolivian government. He had negotiations over 15 years, and to put it simply, he never got anywhere. So the stamps he prepared, or he had prepared by Perkins Bacon, and Bacon was his cousin, quite conveniently, to have a security printer in London. He said, well, can you knock up some stamps for me? They ordered an enormous number. All the orders are actually in the Perkins Bacon archive downstairs in the library, and they're referred to in here. But they were never used for the purpose that they were designed for, ever. It wasn't until 17 years later, in 1857, when the Peruvian government decided that they would want to issue their own postage stamps. They'd set themselves a deadline which they couldn't meet, and they said, oh, we've got some spare ones that the PSNC made that we've never used. So for a very short period of time, there was an experiment, and that's all it was, between 3 centres in Peru when they were used for a matter of weeks. But they were never used on a PSNC vessel, ever. Now, that, quite controversially and interestingly from a postal history point of view, for those who look to find out, to see if there are any copies of these, some of you will have heard of Lindstrom and Tester, the book about private ship markings. They list 7 covers with PSNC stamps allegedly validly used in Peru. Brian Morehouse said to me, and proved it as well because we went through them all, only 2 out of those 7 are genuine, the other 5 are completely duff, and this is why. And they'd been added to, altered, both in terms of stamps added, in terms of date stamps added and taken away. And his records were such that he could go through all the occasions when they'd been up for auction between 1923 and modern times. So I was totally convinced by that. But it wouldn't have been right, notwithstanding the fact that the stamps were never used for the purposes that they were designed for, which was for wheelwrights mail on the west coast of America, South America. It wouldn't have been right not to include a chapter on the stamps, so I did, because I didn't want somebody to say, oh, you missed out the most important thing as far as I'm concerned. It's not where I started, but I just wanted to include it for purposes of fullness. I then described how the service expanded. I mean, originally, if you wanted to get a letter to the west coast of South America, you had to do it through the West Indian ports to Central America, across the Central American Isthmus, and then separately down the coast of west coast of South America. What the PSNC eventually did was, whilst they were servicing that route from 1840 onwards, from Panama going south, eventually in 1868, because they'd had such a row with the people who owned the Panama Railroad, they instituted their own direct route to Liverpool in 1868. That meant that there were some more special cancellations put in place in the Liverpool Post Office. All that's covered in the book. So I'm probably been rambling on a bit too much about it, but anyway, I found it thoroughly interesting, and I hope some of you will too. It was a great help to me, generally, that I had 10 years working in Liverpool before I moved over to what we called the dark side in Yorkshire. I had an office overlooking the Ivy Building and the Maritime Museum. And in the Maritime Museum is what remains of the Pacific Steam Navigation Company archive. It's unfortunately not complete. And it is even true to say that when they were given it in the 1980s, it was more complete than it is now. The list that they've got online is not entirely correct, as I know to the cost when I've been and say I want to see this and we don't know where it is. So I would say it's probably 2/3 of it's there, but there are some interesting things that are missing. So I've tried to include, as I said, a lot of non-philatelic items, tickets, that sort of thing. So that's, I think, all I can say. I've had a great fun doing it. Frank was an enormous help to me early on in understanding InDesign, and Steve Jarvis took that over last year, and he had to put up with me ringing him up saying I can't do this and I can't do that. And sometimes he said, neither can I, I'll have to look. But we got there, didn't we? So basically, thank you very much, really.
It is for sale. I was just about to say it's. There's a copy there at the back, and you can go up to the office to make your purchase. How much is it? Thank you.
Well, apparently it's £60 and 54 for members.
Does anyone have any questions for Mike? No? Well, lunchtime then. Thanks very much, Mike. And we're meeting back here at 2:00.